Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. This is a bench rabbeting plane. Always considered it one of the most feature-packed planes I own. Do you need one? I'm going to build a case, and maybe you'll think so when this is done. We recently had a viewer from Brazil request that we do a review of a bench rabbeting plane, or a 10 1/4, which is what it was technically known as. Now, what I have in front of me here, this is the Lie Nielsen version. This is the original Stanley, which I was lucky enough to get recently. Now, what makes it different from other planes, the primary difference, is the blade is the full width of the body. So you can take a swath, the exact width of the plane, unlike a normal bench plane where your blade stops short on both sides. This one allows you to get right into a vertical surface. So if you can imagine having to plane the entire width of this when it's into a vertical surface, you can do that with this plane. Now, there are other planes that have that same rabbeting or rebating, depending on where you live, capacity. This is called a rabbeting block plane. Blade full width, axis on both sides. This is a shoulder plane. There are various sizes, but again, the blade full width, axis to both sides. And this one, which is called a skew block plane, although it's not open on the opposite side, it is open on this side, which allows you that rabbeting or rebating capacity. And the bonus is that it's skewed, which helps even further with controlling the quality of the surface. So that is the primary difference of a bench rabbeting plane compared to any other jack plane. So as the name implies, it's designed to cut rabbets. So let me show you. I've got a piece of pine with a big rabbet. I could either make it, or in this case I cut it on the table saw, and I want to go and clean it up. I've got to be able to work right to this vertical surface. So the way these work, the blade is a little bit wider than the sole of the plane. And this one is now pushed all the way over. It actually protrudes. So what I'm going to do is, up against another metal surface, I'm going to press that down firmly so that the blade should now be flush with this side. Now I get it parallel to the sole. Nice thing about this is does it not only have a lateral adjustment lever, but also you can open and close the throat to deal with figured wood. Now, oops, my bench dug up too high. Now if I got more material coming off on the right side than the left, I'm just going to come in here and make a slight adjustment with the lever. A little bit more. The nice thing about this plane is the capacity and the position, or the fact that it has a rear tote and front knob that makes it a lot easier to do than if you were trying to do that with a rabbeting block plane, for instance, which it has the width, but it doesn't have near as much ability to hold on to it very well. In a pinch, sure, but this works exceptionally well. Now there will be times that you've got to cut a rabbet or a rebate across the grain as opposed to parallel to it. And if you don't allow for that, you're going to get a torn line. So what the 10 1/4 has, and has one on either side, is called a nicker. There's one there, and there's one there. The Stanley used a star nicker, so you had 3 sides that could be sharp and at different lengths. This one obviously was missing, so that you wouldn't have one there if you didn't need it. I like these better. I think they're easier to sharpen and maybe cut a little better. So bring that out. It actually doesn't need to go that far. Lock that down. Now you really need to make sure that that blade edge is in line with the side of the plane, so that that cut lines up with that cut. Now I'm going to take this piece and put it down the other end. And we'll clamp that on. Obviously, if you're building something, this would have to be very specific. Hold that securely. And then come in here. Just a little too much to one side. I'm going to give it a little more blade. going to try a little more blade. All right, let's have a look at that. That should give us a nice, clean, well-defined line. And it does. Now the cutter may be just a little bit deep. As you can see, it's sitting a little bit below, but that gives us a nice, clean line along there. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our monthly newsletter has subscriber-only content, discounts monthly on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Okay, now to put these two side by side, Lie Nielsen 10 1/4, Stanley 10 1/4. I don't know the vintage on this, but some of the obvious differences are the casting. Lie Nielsen uses ductile iron. It's obviously a heavier casting, and ductile iron is essentially unbreakable. I mean, I'm sure you can break it, but it certainly is going to survive a fall to the floor. Whereas Stanley, using their gray iron, if this hit the concrete floor, there's a good chance it's either going to crack or break. So that was always a weak point. The other big feature is Lie Nielsen added the bedrock feature, meaning you could move the blade and the whole frog assembly forward and back to close down that throat. You had the same option on a Stanley, but you didn't have it in a bedrock. You had to literally take things apart and then adjust it, and if you've ever done that before, it's a real pain. Lie Nielsen went with a much thicker blade. I think this is 125 thou versus what looks to be about 75, 80 thou at the most. Lie Nielsen added the bronze pieces, which is not that big of a deal, but it certainly looks better. The knickers, as I already pointed out, I like this knicker. I think it's easier to sharpen as opposed to the star knicker that Stanley used. The front knob's got a little more size to it, so if you've got a large hand, you're certainly going to appreciate that. Both of them tilt, and I'll show you that in a moment. Other feature or other significant difference, I think I know for a fact that the Lie Nielsen is a better build, better materials. So if longevity is your issue, I'd definitely say the 10 1/4. And even if you can find an original Stanley, I think I paid more for this than I would pay for this brand new. Now, one of the major features about 10 1/4, and the reason why, if you're only going to get one rabbeting plane, you could almost do the same width with this. There's a little bit of a difference, but this is very difficult to hold on to. In particular, if you're using it in an application where you're having to work up against a vertical surface. There really is very little provision for your hand. So the 10 1/4, you could go in, loosen the knob loosen the bolt on the screw on the knob, tip that over, and that goes to either side. Lock it into the position that you want, and you can do the same thing on the rear tote. Now sometimes you have to move the lateral adjustment lever. I'll see if yeah, I do. I'm gonna have to reset that. Go in there, loosen that, lay it over, and again, this one goes just like the front knob, either side. Snug that up, and that's a huge advantage when you're working in a tight situation or, as I said, up against a tall vertical surface. This is a big bonus. Stanley's allowed for the exact same feature. Now let me give you the measurements on these. I think they're very similar. The Stanley's about 1/4 inch longer. So the Lie Nielsen, which is your best option, is 12 3/4 inches long and 2 1/8 inch wide sole. Yeah, just curious. And 2 1/8, yeah, but almost exactly the same widths. Now Stanley also made a number 10, which was a shorter version of this, kind of the same size as a smooth plane. Lie Nielsen doesn't have that, but if I was going to get the one, this would be the one that I would choose for those features. Now let me show you the not so fun part. And some days this works perfectly, and other days it is a pain. I sit there and struggle trying to figure out how I did it. And that is removing the blade. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'll show you. Take the lever cap off, and if you're wondering why that's different, we switched it out. We use 3/16 hex drive, which just makes it a whole lot easier. Remove the lever cap, and you got to do a little bit of a dance with this in order to get it out. There. That seems simple. watch me sometimes. I come in here and I cannot get that thing back together. Oh, we didn't switch that one out. Now, the only thing I do different when I'm sharpening, same David Charlesworth ruler trick on the back, same combination of tertiary, secondary bevel and tertiary bevel. We'll leave a reference to our sharpening video, 32 seconds to sharp, and it'll explain that. The only thing I do different is I keep the edge straight from there to there. I don't do any addressing of the corners. I call it feathering, that we would typically do on a bench plane. The reason is we want to be able to cut right to the edge, and we want it to be a nice straight cut, leaving the surface perfectly flat. So you definitely don't want any feathering on those outside edges. Other than that, everything's done the exact same way. And the Lie Nielsen also uses a new style chip breaker. I'll just take these apart, finish the comparison. Remove that lever cap. I noticed this one came out a lot easier. And again, you'd think, well, why is it hard? Well, I don't know. Can't explain it. We take this one apart. I'm actually going to get out my calipers and measure this just so that you can actually see exactly what the difference is. So first with the Stanley, the blade comes in at 79 thou. The lever cap, and pardon me, the chip breaker, see if I can get a spot where I can grab a hold of it, is 71 thou. And that's the old style that has the bump on the front. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is a little bit harder to address if you have to go in there and get it to lay flat against the back of the blade. I'll set that aside. Now the Lie Nielsen, I'm almost positive this is 125. No, actually it's a little bigger than that. It's 127, 128. And the chip breaker, and this is the new style chip breaker, which is flat, thicker, and just has a little raised lip on the bottom side. And this is coming in at 129. So you got quite a bit more metal. And that makes a big difference when it comes to stopping vibration. So that's definitely a bonus. All right, we're going to close this off by me putting this back in. And it's not, there's some plane gymnastics to do it. So, and I'm being very careful not to touch the blade edge anywhere. Now you think that's easy. There, it's in place. Then you put your lever cap on. The other option, which sometimes is actually easier, is to take the cap screw out so that you're not having to work around it. And I realize it means having to put it back in the same spot. Now you can get in there without having to work around it. Set that in place, put your cap screw back in. Come on. Put your lever cap on. Put it in the cocked position and then snug that up. And I always base that tightness on how easy it is to move the lateral adjustment lever, and that's good. There you go. Now the one thing I didn't show you on this is adjusting the frog, and I'm going to grab my screwdriver and I'll show you how you can do that. So the last part I want to show you on adjustments on this is opening and closing the throat. And if you're not sure what that or why that's essential, if you get into a situation where the grain is reversed on you but you cannot change the direction of planing, if you go in and close the throat down, this part of the sole, by making it, moving it closer and closer to the blade, and actually the blade moving it again. Okay. Now the last thing I want to show you about adjustments is open and closing the throat. Now, if you're not sure why that's important, if you get into a situation where the grain is changing direction and you can't change the direction of planing, then one of the ways that you can go in and help control that tear out is by moving the whole frog assembly, not just the blade, but the whole frog assembly forward to close the gap between this part of the sole and the leading edge of the blade. This part right here puts pressure on the wood fiber, not allowing it to lift up and tear. So you want to be able to go in and make that adjustment. Trying to do it with the original Stanley meant taking the blade out, everything out, going in, loosening these two screws, moving this forward manually without the blade in place, and you're trying to set up a gap between the edge of the blade and this part of the sole, but you're doing it with the blade sitting on the bench, so it's not a very precise procedure. The bedrock style allowed for all of that to occur while the blade, lever cap, chip breaker, everything is in place. Now, I will admit that the screws, the original screws that came with it, are difficult to access because it's rather tight quarters in there. There's 3 screws I have to manipulate. The big adjustment wheel that used to be on there made it even harder because you had to reach around it. We've replaced these with hex drive screws. And using a ball hex, meaning I can get in there, and as long as I can get access to it, I don't have to be straight on. I can be off at an angle, and I can still turn it. So about 1/4 of a turn on either one of those outside, what are called frog retaining screws, loosens it loosens it up enough so I can get into that center screw. And again, I don't have to be straight on. I can get it at any angle, and then I can move that. And what that does is moves the whole assembly forward. And if you watch closely, I can close that throat down until I get the gap that I want, which in this case would be very small if you're trying to control tear out. And then go ahead, tighten up the 2 outside frog retaining screws, and you're back in business. Yes, it's promotion, but this is a big deal, having these hex drive and this ball hex to be able to access that. In other words, it's almost, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to try to get in and get that center screw when you've got that regular adjuster wheel in there. That's your adjustment on the frog on your 10 1/4. Big improvement on the Lie Nielsen over the original Stanley. Now, where do you need it? And where does it pay for itself? I'll give you a couple of examples. I always showed you one. But if you want to make a raised panel and you want to do it by hand so it's nice and clean, you can, and of course this is going to require some fencing, but you can go in there, and this is going to allow you to cut right down into that corner and right down into that corner all the way around. Of course, you could do the back side with a router, with a shoulder plane, or with a rabbeting block plane, but in order to do a panel this size, this is the best tool for the job. And I'm going to save the best for last. If you're interested in making really precise drawers, I mean drawers that just float on a cushion of air. I'll give you an example. Drawers that open and just smooth, no side-to-side slop. Just as perfect a fit as you can get. Well, the case has to be properly done. And this is where I really I love using this plane. So this is a practice case that we made for some students. So oftentimes prior to fitting the drawer, that surface is not as flat as it needs to be. Yes, you can go in and sand it with a block, but it's a lot of work. So what I would do is I would clamp this in position, take my 10 1/4, set the blade up so that the blade is parallel to whichever side I'm going to be working on. I could turn around and come from the other way, but normally I would go front to back on everything, so if there was any tear out, it was reserved or kept in the back. You tilt your handles down in order to avoid busting up your knuckles, and now you can go in there and you can make that pass front to back, and you've got the advantage of a fairly long plane to go in there and make that surface as flat as possible. Now I would go in and I would get it sitting perfectly flat with this, and then I would go in with a long block that I make with sandpaper on it to smooth it up. But this makes short work of what otherwise would be a long, tedious job with sandpaper. Well, without making this sound like a Lie Nielsen infomercial, this is an expensive plane. Wouldn't be the top of my list, but if you're planning to do, as I mentioned, a lot of drawer work and you want that precision that you can only get from an exact fit, I would recommend that a Lie Nielsen 10 1/4 be on your list. I think they do a great job on it. I can't think of anybody that actually makes one, and the original Stanleys aren't as good. The thick blade, the adjustment feature with the bedrock, and I'm shamelessly telling you, go in and buy one of our adjusters. It'll make it so much easier to do that. And that kit for changing out those screws. It's so much easier to deal with that hex drive than it is a regular screwdriver, in particular when you're trying to access those screws that are tucked into a very tight spot. Lie Nielsen 10 1/4 bench rabbeting plane, carriage maker's plane, whatever you want to call it. They did a great job. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.